Well, now for a closer look at New Hampshire and its primary, I'm joined by Keneshia Grant. Keneshia is an assistant professor of political science at Howard University. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So what would you say are the biggest takeaways from the results so far?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that Amy Klobuchar got some support. So we don't see many votes yet, but we see a few of them, and we see that people were supporting her in ways that they didn't in Iowa. So it'll be interesting to see whether that happens across the state. And then we'll be interested to see whether or not Bernie Sanders is able to continue the lead that we see in the polls with him and with Mayor Pete.
Now, it's interesting because obviously billionaire Michael Bloomberg took a less conventional campaign route. Is that paying off, though, based on his performance so far?
I think it is. I think we have all been waiting to see kind of what the role of money is and whether it's the case that you can advertise your way into the presidency. And it looks like people are more familiar with his name than they were when we started this election. And it also looks like he is pulling away some of the support from the other candidates. And so it looks like it might be possible that his strategy to wait and just advertise online and to see what happens in the later states might benefit him.
Now, for candidates who didn't make the top five, I mean, what sort of conversations are they usually having at this point in their campaigns?
At this point in their campaigns, they're thinking about what it might look like to close the campaign. And so they're wondering whether they have enough money to keep their staff and to pay their staff. They're wondering whether something might happen that will change the tide. So many of them will be watching the results tonight, and if the results go well, then they'll look to say, hey, supporters, give me more funds, and I'll use those funds to go forward. But money will be the key thing that everybody's thinking about tonight.
And certainly seems to be surprising, at least for former Vice President Joe Biden's camp. What do you make of his performance so far?
I do think that's surprising. He has positioned himself all along as the person who is most electable, but has not won the first election out, the caucus. And so it looks like he didn't win the caucus, and he probably won't win this primary. And that's just surprising. We'll be waiting to see how the things turn out for him in South Carolina, where it's the place that he's betting heavily on African-American voters coming out to help him.
So let's actually look at the demographics then in New Hampshire. Who are the voters in New Hampshire, and what are the issues that are really the most important to them?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with the description of them earlier. They're a bit older. There are many of them who are working class, who work in the economies that you named. They are overwhelmingly white, so 90% of that population is white. There are a few minorities there, a few Asians, a few black people, a few Hispanic people there. And so that gives us a kind of sense of what might happen in the election, but not a sense of everything that happens as it usually does in the United States of America. And so this is important because it's the first one, but it also is not representative because the population is not so representative.
That's interesting, because that was the same situation in Ohio. So a lot of people are wondering, is it time then to perhaps pick some states that are more representative of the current demographics of the entire country?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is time for that. The caucuses have historically done what they needed to do, and the New Hampshire primary is first by their laws. They have to be first. And I think that we shouldn't rest on what happened in the past. The nation has changed, and so I think it might be time for us to revisit how we do these things and maybe even have a bunch of states go first together that are more diverse than instead of having these states that don't really represent the American public.
So for people who aren't familiar with the system, how do the Iowa caucus and the New Hampshire primary differ?
That's a good question. So the Iowa caucus, one of the big differences that's going to be important is that the Iowa caucus is run by the Iowa Democratic Party, whereas the New Hampshire primary is run by the state of New Hampshire. And so remember last week we were waiting and waiting and waiting for these results, and they never came. And that was a part of a function of the way that they organized their work. The primary is different because it's organized by the state, so it's held to different standards. The other major difference is that the caucus is a relationship between individuals where they move in rooms to declare their preferences, whereas the primary happens through a secret ballot. And so we should absolutely know today in real time what is happening with these voters, which was very different from what we experienced last time.
And as we look in New Hampshire, we know that it has a history of manufacturing. What are some of the other growth drivers there?
I think we have the history of manufacturing. We have tourism, as you mentioned. It's very close to Boston. And so when you look at the map of New Hampshire, you see some of the things that are happening there right outside Boston. You have some universities there that drive growth. But the further up you go north in the state, the less likely it is that you see growth. In fact, you see some population loss where people are making decisions to go to other places.
And we also did see that with Iowa. How do you make it so that New Hampshire becomes a place that does attract more residents and perhaps more that will help grow the economy there?
I think a part of it has to do with how they train workers. And so one of the debates that's happening in the Democratic Party is about student loan debt and what we do for people who decide not to go to college. And so if it's going to be the case that manufacturing has changed and it has become more tech-driven, then it has to also be the case that we train our workers to be good at tech. If they are still working on a model from the 1950s or 60s, then they're going to be left behind in the tech revolution. And so I think that the folks who live there are suffering because they don't really have the training that they need to be competitive in the global market today.
All right, well, thank you so much for your insights. Keneshia Grant, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Howard University.